Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Evan Thornley, the chair of the board at Longview, and he is Mark Brilliant, who's the head of our professional purchasing team. Thank you for joining us. This is a slightly provocative webinar because we have realised that many of our clients actually have made more investment returns on the homes they live in than they have on the investment properties they specifically bought for the purposes of making money. And we wanted to talk about why that was and what you could do about that. Not about not making money on your home, that's great, but about making more successful investments with your investment properties. So we'll kick it off. Essentially, we're going to go through a little bit of that data and then talk about, well, why is it that that is the case? Why is it that a large proportion of the property investors we know actually make more money in the home they live in than they do in their investment properties? And we'll unpack that. And that's interesting, but not necessarily useful, because then the question is, well, what should I do about it, guys, if that's the case? And we want to give you some examples and a different way of thinking about how you make investment decisions in property to give you a much better chance of having a good outcome. And that's exactly the type of support that we provide our clients, that Mark leads that team. It gives you a sense of what we do. So let's get right into it. I'm still getting used to this platform, but we will get there. I'll get us out of the way. Hang on. There we go. Okay. We have many clients who buy their first home or buy a home, their second or third home. Their home does well for them. They're very happy that they've enjoyed living there and they've ended up gaining quite a lot of equity value, and then they go out and buy an investment property to start building their financial security for the future. But then when they look back 10 years later, they find out the investment property wasn't that good a deal, and indeed wasn't as good a deal as their home. And why is that? So we wanted to start by unpacking, how do you make money in property investment? And we've just got a typical example here. Here's a property that was bought for maybe $450,000 10 years ago, sold for $880,000 last year. So, you know, good solid growth, about 7% compound capital growth in the value of the property. And then it was rented out over that period, and it also generated rental income. But what I think you can see from this very typical example is that the big number on the page, the big value, is the capital growth in the property. You know, this client made $435,000 from the increase in the value of the property. They made $156,000 from their net rental. That is the total amount tenants paid minus the usual expenses for maintenance and rates and insurance and property management and so on. So the rental income was important, and obviously it helped pay the mortgage, but the big money was in capital growth. And this is typically the case. So when you're thinking about the investment performance of an investment property, the capital growth is going to be the most important component. We add the two together, as you can see on the right-hand side. The way we judge all investment property performance is a metric we call total returns. That is the amount of increase in price, the capital growth, and the amount of net rental income, the amount of the rent that actually ended up in your bank account. You put those two together, that gives you total returns, and we reduce that to a single number per annum so that you can compare apples with different price properties over different time periods. You compare the total returns per annum, and you've got an accurate way of working out which was the better investment. So why is it that people's homes often do better than their investment properties? Mark, I'm going to throw it to you because we think that the type of housing that you buy is a really critical driver of capital growth. Do you want to take us through this?
Yeah, thanks, Evan. And this is a sort of we're not making any recommendations on specific properties here, but what we've found that these are typical averages that we see with properties that we help our landlords to manage. And these properties were all purchased 10 years ago for around $450,000, and you can see that the first one there, the apartment, which is now only worth $470,000, it's effectively had 0.5% compounding growth for that every year for 10 years. It's virtually gone nowhere. And I mean, if they had to sell this property today, in fact, they'd probably make a loss after paying all the costs. The second example at 4% compounding per year is a good example of a villa unit or a townhouse where there's some reasonable capital growth. I mean, they've sold that for $666,000. There's certainly a good profit made there. And the previous example that you were highlighting there, where it sold for $880,000, they've done extremely well. And that is the typical example of what you're talking about, where people buy their family home. It might be their first home or their second family home. They're not specifically buying it necessarily as an investment, but the fundamentals of what that property is mean that it's getting this terrific capital growth over, say, in this case, a 10-year period.
And so we're not saying here that every house is a great investment and every unit is a bad investment.
No.
By no means. We've certainly seen units that do get 6 or 7% annual growth, which is fabulous, but we don't see very many of them.
No.
And we've certainly seen some houses that have poor investment performance, but we don't see many of them either. So these numbers are actually the Melbourne average across these different housing types. So this goes to what was in our first webinar, Property Investment 101. Why is this the case? Why are we seeing stronger investment performance from houses than we see in villas or townhouses, and stronger investment performance there than we see in apartments? And as we said on the last webinar, but it's so important, we'll say it again. The golden rule, the first golden rule of property investment is that land appreciates in value, buildings depreciate in value. No matter how beautiful they are, in fact, the more beautiful they are, the more depreciation you're going to get. And so the two golden rules we always talk about is buy properties with the highest land content, and then what type of land is it? How unusually good is the location of that land? That will determine how fast the land appreciates. So let's talk first about land content, and this kind of goes back to the different housing types. Mark, why don't you take us through two examples of how to think about, am I putting a lot of my money into land, or am I putting a lot of my money into buildings? Yeah,
this is a typical example here, Evan, where perhaps it might be an apartment, for example, that you purchase for $400,000, and the amount of land and the value of the land that you're actually buying only makes up, in this case, 25% of the purchase price. So $300,000 of your purchase price has gone into buying the building, buying the apartment, or buying the house, and you've only bought $100,000 worth of land. So you've only got $100,000 of land to go up in value, while your $300,000 is actually depreciating and getting older and going down in value.
And so when we say, take this apartment example, you bought $100,000 worth of land. So maybe that's $1 million block of land with 10 apartments on it.
With 10 apartments, absolutely.
So your share of land, your share of the value of the land is $100,000 in that case.
Yeah. That's right. And we've actually got a couple of examples that we'll get to a bit later on.
Right. Okay. And then, but in a different situation, same amount of purchase money for the property, $400,000.
But in this case, most of the money is going into the land. So it's, going into purchasing the land. It doesn't necessarily mean the huge block of land, but the value is in the land. So it could be a really well-located house on however many hundred of square meters, but the value is in buying the land. The house is most likely an older home built 30, 40, 50, even longer ago, and it's depreciated in value. It's now worth only, in this case, $80,000. It's not uncommon at all to see clients buy a property like this for $400,000 and then knock the house over and develop or build on the property. So effectively, they're paying 100%. They're buying 100% of land. So this is the more typical example where you get that extra capital growth, because you've got, in this case, $320,000 worth of land to continue appreciating over time.
Right. So when you play out that dynamic, what portion of your money is in the growing asset? That's the land. What portion of your money is in the shrinking asset? That's the building. You put those two together, and this is kind of what happens, yeah?
And that's like, going back to the graph previously, the apartment was bought for $400, it was at $450, and it was only sold for $470, whereas a house that, is bought for around $400 can easily sell for $750 10 years later, because most of the money is in the land.
Yeah. So this to me was the startling thing that is sort of obvious. Most of us know this, but until we actually did the analysis, I didn't realise how stark it was. The pink line is the type of housing that people buy to live in for their home. The grey line is the types of housing that they buy for investment properties. And you can see something very clear. Most people, 8 out of 10 people, when they're buying the family home, buy a house, which is, interestingly enough, the type of housing that has, as we've just discussed, the best capital growth. Why? Because it's got the highest land content. The highest proportion of your money has gone into the valuable asset, which is the land. Yet when people go to buy a property for the sole purpose of making money, for a bunch of reasons we'll talk about in a minute, they often put that money more into buildings than into land, which is not going to deliver as good a return. And really, this page summarises the provocative title of this webinar. Why is it that many people have a more successful investment with their home than they do with their investment property? And the answer is actually pretty simple, because in most cases, their home is a house, often an older house with a nice yard and plenty of land, and often their investment is an apartment, often a newer apartment. So most of their money's gone into the depreciating asset, the shrinking asset.
Yeah, it's everybody buys their home and upgrades and gets the best family home that they can, Evan, for family reasons. To be in the suburb they want to live in, near the schools and the shops and the transport that they want, and inevitably they buy a house that has as much land as they can afford, and they're prepared to go into serious debt to finance that lifestyle. What they're actually doing as a consequence or a byproduct of that is actually buying a really good investment, which is as much land in a good location as they can afford. It's just such a shame when we see that investors, when they go to purchase solely for the purpose of making money, they actually use a different set of criteria to source the kind of property.
Yeah. And as we've talked to hundreds of our clients, we've come to an understanding of why that is, which I'll get to in 1 second. There's a second part of this, which is just important to note, which is you also tend to get better tax outcomes on the family home. And particularly so because that large capital growth that you get, you don't pay any capital gains tax on, because it's the family home, it's exempt from capital gains tax. Whereas for an investment property, you'd have to pay capital gains tax. And so not only do people tend to buy a better performing asset to live in their family home, they also get better tax treatment. And I think that's quite ironic, because a lot of the time when I see new developers and real estate sales agents trying to sell new apartments, for example, they get people all excited about the tax benefits of all the depreciation you're going to get, or all the money you'll save with negative gearing. And I want to be clear, those benefits are real and they're material. The depreciation benefits on a new apartment are significant. It will take quite a bit off your tax. But that's because it's a depreciating asset which is actually losing value. And so while those benefits are real and material, they're simply not as big as the benefits you get from capital growth, not by a long shot, not by a factor of 10. In fact, they're not even as big as the tax benefits you get from not paying tax on your capital growth, which is what you get when the capital growth occurs in your family home. So why is it then that so many people buy properties that are relatively poor performing, typically the wrong type of property, as an investment? And look, through hundreds of our client conversations, I think we've started to have a really clear understanding of the way people think through the question of, okay, maybe we've bought our family home, maybe we've bought our second or third family home, we've actually made good money on those while we've enjoyed living there. Now we feel like we've got enough money to set aside and buy an investment property to start building some wealth for ourselves and financial security. Fantastic. But then something goes wrong. But it's a very easy thing to understand, because it's very logical. People are very logical, but in our view, generally wrong. And the logical thing they say is, well, look, I bought this lovely home in wherever, Glen Iris, and we've loved living here and we've made lots of money. So now we can buy an investment property. Glen Iris is clearly a good place to buy, to make investment, because we've made so much money on our home. Let's go buy something round the corner here. We know the area, we know what stuff's worth, we won't be tricked into paying too much, and we know it's a good investment because we know from our own home it's a good investment. But then they go to their budget and say, oh, well, but around where we live, the only thing we can afford is, say, an apartment. And so on the left-hand side, this is the approach people take. They say, well, I want to buy somewhere familiar to me that I know, either close to where I live or somewhere I'm familiar with because it's in the inner city and it's a very well-known suburb, St Kilda or Richmond or Windsor or somewhere. And I've heard that those places close to the city get lots of capital growth. And then they say, oh, but I've only got a certain amount of money, so I'll buy that location, but I'll only buy what I can buy in that location with my dollars, which is usually an apartment. And they think through, well, how much rent do I need to get to be able to pay the mortgage on it? And then their accountant and the spruikers for the property, so there's all these tax benefits. And next thing you know, they're buying a relatively new apartment, either close to home or in the inner city, and feeling like that's going to be a great property investment. Then they go and find a property manager and get on their way. 10 years later, they open the box and there's not much there. The wealth that they thought and they'd been told they were building just doesn't eventuate for the reasons we talked about above. And so we'd like to propose a different approach, and Mark will take you through how we do this in a moment, which is, let's start with, okay, how much money can you afford? 450, 650,000, whatever. Let's work out how much you can afford, work that out with your accountant and your tax planning and so on. Okay, now what we want to do is spend that amount of money on the right housing type. That is a housing type that has a large land content, either a house itself or at least a villa unit or townhouse, because they're likely to get the good capital growth. Okay, well, given I've got this amount of money and I'm trying to buy this type of housing, where are the locations where I can afford to buy that type of housing? And they may not be locations that you're familiar with. They may not be close to home. They may not be the sort of famous inner city suburbs. But you'll be able to get good land content in good locations in somewhere perhaps less familiar. Then you choose the right specific property, because every property is different. You're not buying a suburb, you're buying a property. And then negotiate the best price on it and then get somebody to manage it for you. We can do all of that. So you can see there's a difference in the order in which people make their decisions. And our approach is a little less comfortable for people because it may mean you end up buying a property in a location you're not as familiar with, but it almost always results in a better outcome.
One thing certainly, Evan, that I've noticed with my clients over the years is that you end up, the search ends up being perhaps on the other side of the city or an area that they're very unfamiliar with, or an area where, to be quite frank, they wouldn't want to live. And that can be a little bit confronting and challenging for people, because it is, going back to your first example, people want to buy what they know and what they're comfortable with. And your Glen Iris example is perfect. People know that the area has been performing well over the years. They love the area. That's got great shops and transport. They know it so well that it just makes sense at the time to keep it local. Whereas often the best opportunities and the land content is found in different areas, to be quite honest.
Yeah. And again, I'm not saying I wouldn't buy something in Glen Iris. I've seen some lovely old period apartments which have a high land content. There's only maybe 4 or 6 in the block on a big block of land, large apartments, got a courtyard in a good location. That may still be a good investment. But a brand new apartment in a brand new development, maybe a 1-bedroom apartment in a brand new development.
Yeah, on Burke Road, Glen Iris or something like that. It's just not.
Yeah. If that's as much as you can afford, don't buy it there. Because you'll end up buying the wrong type of property. So look, I think, Mark, you've done just grabbed some examples from recent sales. So we're not recommending any of these properties. In fact, they've just been sold. But just to give people a flavour for, for the same amount of money, you can get different housing types in different locations. So I'll get you to take people through these examples. But what we've also done is look at the historical investment performance of these properties, and it sort of bears out what we've been saying. So Mark, why don't you take people through? I think you've got 2 price points here, sort of 450 odd and about 650.
So the first
sort of money people often spend on their first investment property.
Absolutely. So yeah, the first line going across is properties all for around about mid fours, 450. And we've chosen an inner city property, a middle ring, an outer suburb, and then a regional city property. And these are just very typical examples of what you get for that type of budget. So the first one in Bricksworks Drive in Brunswick, very typical apartment for the area. It's a very desirable spot for young people, for singles, for students. They rent out really well. It's 5-minute tram ride into the city. It's a desirable area, but unfortunately there's over 40 apartments in this particular block, and out of your $452,000, you're actually only getting 23 square meters of land that you're sharing with all those other apartments. So, as from a capital growth perspective, it's going to be limited because there really isn't much land component to this property.
In fact, we had to search, I think, for quite a while to even find anything in the inner city we even wanted to show people. This was one of the better performing inner city apartments, and that was because it was in a relatively unique development next to a park and a bunch of other things. And then it got 3% capital growth, which is pretty anemic, but better than 0.5.
That's right.
So this even was a really good example, as good as you could get in this price point, in this location, and yet compared to these other properties, not as good.
That's right. And it's important to remember these are total returns. So this is the compounding capital growth plus the net rental yield. So, half of that 6.6 is the rental yield. So its capital growth is quite limited. The next property along in Mentone is an older style single level. It's actually a 1-bedroom unit. And it just goes to show, for mid fours, it's really quite hard to buy something with land in a middle ring suburb in Melbourne. But this property comes with 82 square meters of land.
When you say unit, it's a villa, right?
It's a villa, yeah. Yeah, it's a villa, a single level villa, which is still very popular with younger buyers and older buyers. And so you end up 26% of your money's going into the land. And so you can see the difference in return. We go from 6.6 to 9%. That simply in the property selection, instead of buying the inner city apartment, if you buy that pretty daggy 40 or 50-year-old unit, you're going to get 9% returning per year. And then even better,
Croydon, like way further out.
Some people would ask you, where's Croydon? But we're buying a unit here. I think there was only 6 in the block. It was quite a large piece of land with a lot of grass, open area, body corporate land.
Sorry, when you say unit, you mean like a villa?
Villa. Yeah, apologies. And so you're getting 184 square meters of land. So you're actually land content's up to 34%, and you can see the total returns here at over 10% for a villa in Croydon, which a lot of investors who might be thinking, like you said, I've got 450. I'm going to buy an investment in an inner suburb or Glen Iris or an inner ring where I'm comfortable and I know. But you can actually almost double your returns by going further from the city, but buying a property that's got a good land content, but importantly as well located and popular land. So.
I was going to say this is close to the station, close to the shops. It's not just any location in Croydon; it's a good location in Croydon.
Don't get me wrong. There's properties in Croydon that won't return as well as this, but it's not impossible to find properties like this at all. And then you can see a regional option as well. So we there's a great example there of something in inner Ballarat, really quite close to the town centre. In this house was a really nice period renovated house, and 67% of the purchase price was actually going into the land. A really well located central land there, and generating really strong returns, far stronger than Brunswick and pretty close to Mentone.
And then bottom sort of upper price bracket at 650.
650, yeah. So, and again, so what we were able to do with the first property is it's at 650. The jump from 450 to 650 meant that we didn't have to get an apartment in Brunswick. We were able to get a small, older style villa unit.
Right.
And what that meant was we were able to secure 128 square meters of land. 36% of the value went into the land, and so the return at 7.2% is slightly better than at the 450 level. Going further out from the city, finding more well-located land in Chadstone meant that we were able to buy 168 square metres of land associated. There was this sort of newer unit, it's a villa, there's only 3 on the block, so you end up getting 168 square metres of land, and you're actually returning over 8% in total. But even better returns further out again, really well-located land in Ferntree Gully. To be frank, this type of land at 928 square metres has also got future development potential, which is something that we could obviously go into in more detail. But 928 square metres of well-located land, 86% of your money is buying the land. So you're almost getting the house for free, and the house is going to generate rental income, but what you're buying, the vast majority of what you're buying in this example is land. And so is the last example in Launceston. Again, you're putting 84% of your money into the land, and the land is what is appreciating. So great example.
Old period home, nice little old period home, but central Launceston, so a lot of dirt right in the centre of town. So very well located land and plenty of it. And so folks, I think you can see here, your budget is not your limitation on buying a good investment property. It just directs you where you might buy that property to get the type of property that's going to generate strong capital growth. And if that might require you to invest in a location you're not familiar with, that's fine. That's what we're here to help you with. Frankly, we are familiar with all these locations. We do this for a living. Mark's been doing it for decades. The important thing is that your money is working hard for you. And for your money to be working hard, it must be principally put into land and well-located land. And then over the long term, you're going to get the sort of investment performance you're looking for. So by no means change your budget. Your budget is what your budget is. Let's work together on finding the right type of property in a location where you can afford the right type of property, and you'll still get the investment returns you're looking for regardless of your budget.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I just wanted to give a couple of examples of the logic that we've talked about, because it can lead in every time we sit down and talk with a client, we really want to understand their particular situation, what their family needs are, what their financial circumstance are, how far through the life cycle they are, how much they're focused on capital growth versus income. Typically, as people move towards retirement, they're more focused on income and everything. And look at all of their property together, both the home they live in and their investment properties, and help them make the best decision. Now, this to me was a really interesting example because it was counterintuitive for our client. But I believe we're just talking through this at the moment with them, and I hope they go down this path because it's a total win-win. So we've got a client whose their home is in Altona Meadows. They're very hardworking, good, honest, hardworking people. Lived in a modest home so they can put money aside for their future. Bought a couple of investment properties so that they're building long-term financial security for themselves. Playing by the rules, doing all the right things. But now the kids are getting older. They'd like to move to central Altona, have the kids closer to school. It's a better location, closer to the station, the school, the beach. But they can't necessarily afford to buy the type of home they'd love to live in central Altona because they've actually, put money into their investment properties. But when we looked at this situation, it turns out that the investment properties they bought unfortunately were new apartments, which really, frankly, weren't performing very well. And yet the type of home that they aspired to live in central Altona historically had performed really well and is likely to perform really well in future. So in this case, our recommendation is actually, you know what, this is a win-win. Sell one of the investment apartments, which is never going to make you a lot of money, take some of that money and use it to buy a better home than you thought you could afford to live in. And while that sounds like you're being indulgent, you'll actually make a lot more money. So it's a really interesting example of being clever about the way you look at your whole property portfolio and all of your both lifestyle and financial needs to get the best outcome. And in this case, the outcome was actually to buy a better home and still make more money. Mark, do you want to take us through a different example, perhaps a more kind of conventional example of where we would say to people, I know this feels bad, but it's worth doing some hard work now to make more money later?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is not uncommon at all, where we have a client, in this case, with 3 investment properties. We have a lot of clients who have multiple investment properties, and unfortunately they've got 3 sort of more modern apartments, and the growth has been really quite limited. And you can see here that, you know, over the next 10 years, if it continues on its trajectory, which it most likely will, they're looking at probably only adding $120,000 in
across the 3,
across 3 over 10 years. Whereas our advice is, look, and it's challenging advice, which is that, look, to sell these properties and go out and buy a couple of other properties, there are changeover costs, and we've highlighted it here at around $73,000. If we were to sell these,
a lot of money. Yeah,
it's a huge amount of money, and you know, to sell 3 properties takes time and effort and money. And but what we've calculated is, if we can buy 2 good investment properties, one perhaps a house, maybe the example there was maybe the Ferntree Gully house with a really good piece of land, and maybe a great villa unit in a middle ring suburb, for the same amount of capital that they've got outlaid and the same amount of borrowings that they've already got on 3 underperforming investment properties, they actually stand to make a net benefit of over $500,000 over that 10 years. So it's quite extraordinary, the difference of doing nothing versus making the tough decision, which is a $73,000 decision, but in 10 years, you know, it stands to be over $500,000 better off.
And so, I mean, to me, this is just the classic. We talk about this as changing trains. If you're on a slow train, these folks have got 3 slow trains going very slowly along the track here on the left. Let's get them on some fast trains that are going much, much quicker. It costs them time and money to change trains, but within a few years, you get all of that back and more. And so, you know, the cost to change trains here was a lot of money, $73,000. That would have felt really bad at the time. But I like to think about the alternative cost. What's the cost of doing nothing? The cost of sitting still with these relatively poor investments? Well, the answer is the difference between these 2 numbers. It's 557,000 of gain versus 120. So the cost of doing nothing here would have been $437,000.
And that's probably where we see so many people that are challenged, Evan, is because it's clients often look at this and it's too hard to or the focus is on the $73,000, which is an awful lot of money, but it is actually technically only on paper at this stage. And you're exactly right. What they're actually missing out on over the next 10 years is over $400,000 if they can make the challenging and tough decisions now. It's a very classic example of taking 1 step back to take 2 steps forward. There's an error here that needs to be corrected, and if we can correct it, then the properties that we purchase for these clients will far outweigh the small cost now. Yeah.
Okay, so folks, that's what we wanted to go through today. It was interesting to look at both your home and your investment properties, both in the context of them being property investments, which they are. Obviously, there's many other factors go into a home, but some quite counterintuitive observations that I think might lead you to think carefully, and love to work with you to help think through the right answer for you and your family to get the greatest potential return, both lifestyle and financially, from all of the property that you own. So we're now open to questions. I see one here already from Tim. Sorry, I may have missed this previously, but how did you arrive at the land content percentage? So I'll just take you through that, Tim, because so what we try and do is we take any property. Let's say we bought a property for $600,000, and we imagine, what if there was no building there and you just bought the land that the property sits on? And it's easy to get the value of land in any particular location. There's a sort of, you know, dollars per square meter number you can find fairly easily. So let's say that the land itself was worth $400,000, even if there was no building on it, but you paid $600,000 for the property. Well, that means no matter what you might think of the building that's on it, whether it's a fancy house or a tumble down shack, it doesn't really matter. What the market's telling you is that the value of that building was the remaining $200,000, right? Because we know what the value of the land is. The value of the building, by definition, is whatever's left over. So you've put $400,000 of your money into the growing asset, which is the land, $200,000 of your money into the shrinking asset, which is the building. So when we say what's the land content, we say what's the proportion of your money that went into the growing asset. So in this case, $400,000 out of a total of 600,000, so that's 2/3. So your land content is 2/3 or 67%. I hope that example is clear.
And for the ones where it was a villa unit or townhouse or apartment, what we also took into account is the full block of body corporate or owners corporation land. So, it might have been that the whole block of land is 2,000 square meters. It's quite easy to calculate and find examples of what 2,000 square meters might be worth in any particular suburb. You can find examples of sales that have been development sites and work out square meter rates for most suburbs. And for example, the one in Croydon, I think there was 5 or 6 units on that block. So you're effectively buying 1/5 or 1/6 of that land, because you're buying the land that is associated with your title, but you're also buying an equal share of the owner's corporation land as well. So we factor all that into the calculation.
So I think, folks, the key message here is you may or may not have followed all those numbers as they flew out of our mouths. We can help you do all this. This is kind of what we do for a living. The really key message we wanted you to take away is you want your money as much as possible to be in land, well-located land, unusually well-located land, and the smallest proportion as possible of your money in the building. And that's how you're going to maximise your long-term wealth generation. And we can help you make all those calculations so that you know that you're getting the right thing. We can calculate the historical capital growth of any property so that you can get a sense of the total returns, so we can measure apples to apples in terms of which properties are performing better than others, and work all these things through with you. So look, we're open for other questions. Not sure if we'll have any more today, but please type them in if you have them, and if not, we will make a copy of this presentation available going forward, so you can go back and review it. And most importantly, just feel free to give us a call. Give Mark a call, give me a call. It's no charge to have a chat. We really want to help you get to the right place. We're happy to talk through what your options are and work stuff through together. If that sounds like it's helpful, then you can engage us professionally to support you in whatever it is you need to do, whether that's selling a property to buy a better one, whether it's thinking about how you get a better family home, how all those things fit together. So just got another question's come in from Sharon. If you have the chance to buy the house next door, is it worth it? Well, so Sharon, that will depend a little bit on where you are. So is the property that you're in currently well-located land? Because if it is, you almost certainly would love to buy the property next door. It'll also depend a bit on the zoning. So it's a conditional yes.
Yeah.
But Mark, I want to talk a little bit about how would you make that decision, and why would it likely be a good idea to buy the property next door if you can?
Yeah, really interesting question, actually. I've had a couple of examples this year with some of our landlords, and in one example, the property did come up next door, and the client had purchased it, and then when we looked at it, it actually, there was no inherent extra value by putting that. She thought that by putting the two properties next door to each other, that it would have higher development potential and be worth more money as one asset. But
which is often the case,
yeah, which can be the case. But in this particular case, it wasn't. Her area wasn't really zoned for higher density development. The houses themselves were quite nice homes, and so a higher percentage of the money, of the value, was actually in the house and not in the land. So it does need to be looked at on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
Some examples, it would just be a no-brainer, and you would do everything possible to buy your neighbour's property if it came up. And other times, it doesn't necessarily make sense.
So I think it sounds like the criteria that would help you make that decision are, firstly, whether both those properties are in a desirable location, are in an unusually good location, and then if they are, then what's the zoning? So will having twice as much land allow someone to develop it into a lot of extra housing in the future? And how new or old is the house on that property next door? Because you don't want to be putting much money into a house if the only value is to knock it down and do a development. So I think those would be the criteria we'd use to assess that one, Sharon. Great question. happy to look at it if you're looking at something live right now.
Yes, send me an email. I'm more than happy to look into it for you and come back to you with some ideas.
Okay. If we don't have any other questions, folks, we'll finish it up today. Thanks for watching. Thanks for your engagement. I hope you found this interesting. It was quite a provocative title, but it's quite profound what's happening in many people's lives, and where they're making money where they don't intend to, and not making money where they do intend to. We'd like you to make money in both, and of course we want to make sure that the family home, first and foremost, is a great place for you and the people you love. So thanks for your time. We'll have more of these. Our next webinar will be on debt, on borrowing money to buy property, on gearing as it's often called, and how much should you borrow versus how much of your own money should you put in? What are the costs and benefits associated with that? What are the tax implications? So that'll be Property Investment 103, debt and gearing, and look forward to seeing you then. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.